So, a couple of weeks ago, The Conjuring Last Rites opened to a whopping $84 million domestic and $194 million worldwide. That was the highest grossing opening for the franchise, the biggest global opening for a horror movie ever, and the third highest opening for a horror movie domestically. It's a lot of money. This opening took some observers by surprise. New Line had estimated a conservative $35 million opening, and even the more bullish predictions had a little over 50. But this gets at the sense in which the Conjuring franchise has always been somewhat overlooked and undervalued in pop culture coverage. The success of Last Rites shouldn't be that much of a surprise. It's a sequel which is being sold as a farewell to a film series that launched between 8 and 15 years ago, which is, like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, John Wick Chapter 4, and even Minions 2: The Rise of Gru, almost laser-guided to appeal to audience nostalgia. This is aimed at filmgoers who are old enough to have seen the first Conjuring in 2013, but aren't so old that they've aged out of the largest theater-going demographic of 18 to 34-year-olds. The Conjuring series has never really occupied the center of culture like the larger, modern mega franchises, such as the MCU, the DCEU, or the Spamunk. However, there is a convincing argument to be made that it is quietly the second most successful shared universe in Hollywood. Not in terms of raw dollar grosses, although the Conjuring universe offers a $10 return on every dollar invested by the film studio, which is significantly higher rate of return than the Marvel Cinematic Universe or even the James Bond films. No, we're talking about actually combining financial success and resiliency with the capacity to support an actual expansive universe around the property. The Conjuring isn't like, say, the Fast and Furious, which is effectively a single film series with one spin-off that didn't really work, so let's pretend that never happened. It also isn't like the various attempts at a DC universe, where there's a palpable ambiguity around what counts and how connected everything is to anything else, and a huge variance in terms of tone. This is a franchise that has successfully launched spin-off films, that have themselves gone on to launch their own franchises, and some of those spin-offs have then launched their own spin-offs, even if we're not entirely sure if that one counts or not. The Conjuring universe features cameos seeding characters for their own spin-offs, with the first shot of the first film being of Annabelle the creepy doll. Its movies end on sequel hooks.
And if we can, then he'd like to meet with us tomorrow. There's a case in Long Island he'd like to discuss.
Really?
They include post-credit scenes teasing the next standalone film. It also features crossover spectaculars, with the third Annabelle film bringing back OG stars Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson for what is effectively Annabelle Civil War. It is basically the closest that any other studio has come to emulating the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it's for a middle-brow throwback to 70s horror cinema. And it's created enough brand loyalty that the big finale was a record-breaking success. So, this week, we're going to talk about The Conjuring, quietly one of the most interesting major Hollywood franchises of the past decade or so. Now, normally, I'd segue into the show itself with a clumsy pun, but this week, don't worry. There's gonna be none of that. Frankly, I'm out of the habit, and I know it would just make some of you cross. Okay, enough suspense, let's just do it and begin the show. Of course, one of the reasons that people probably don't talk that much about the Conjuring franchise is because it means having to talk about the Warrens. The Conjuring series purports to be based on a true story, which I suppose is technically accurate in that it is truly a story. The series purports to depict real-life, supernatural cases, such as the Enfield poltergeist or the infamous Devil Made Me Do It trial, and is built around the real-life figures of Ed and Lorraine Warren. This immediately lends the film series the vague sense of crass exploitation that one might associate with true crime podcasts. In the case of the third film in the mainline Conjuring franchise, The Devil Made Me Do It, it feels like the series is sensationalizing real-life tragedy for cheap scares, effectively turning the suffering of real people in a murder case into a spectral soap opera. And then there's the Warrens themselves. In the films, they're played by Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga, and one of the best parts of the franchise is the warm relationship between the pair. It's one of the sweetest and most wholesome depictions of marriage in mainstream pop culture, and a large part of the appeal of the films is watching the two actors enjoy an easy chemistry together. I just want Scream King Patrick Wilson to be happy. For the on-screen version of the Warrens, there's no melodrama, no angst, and no unnecessary tension. Well, aside from the fact that their daughter's been played by 3 different actors across the film franchise, but look, no family is perfect. Of course, this on-screen domestic bliss is reportedly enforced by the Warrens having it written into the deal that they made with the studio. That deal insisted that their marriage would always be portrayed as harmonious, most likely because they were concerned that the films might at some point want to address reports that Ed had a protracted extramarital affair with Judith Penny, which began when she was 15 years of age. According to Penny, when she got pregnant as a result of this affair, Lorraine bullied her into having an abortion. Penny also claims that the Warrens were physically abusive. So, building a film franchise around the Warrens has baggage. More broadly, even setting aside those specific allegations, which you probably shouldn't set aside, the film series serves as a multi-million-dollar advertisement for the Warrens, who have widely been declared as dangerous charlatans and predatory frauds. The films painstakingly whitewash the couple.
Right now it's just my weight. We take the water coming off of the pipe combined with the wind coming through the broken window, these boards are going to expand and rub against each other.
Going out of their way to insist that the pair are open to rational explanations for these phenomena.
So, this place isn't haunted?
No, it rarely is. Yeah, there's usually always some kind of rational explanation.
And making a point to treat any skeptics as closed-minded fools who are blind to the real evil in the world.
Honestly, I don't know what was worse, the demons or the people who prey on our willingness to believe in them.
The demons are worse.
This is a fundamental flaw with the franchise, and it makes it hard to talk about the films in any real depth because, well, sometimes the monster isn't a 7-foot-tall nun from Romania, I think? I'm gonna be honest, I didn't rewatch the Nun movies for this. As a result, there's a cynicism at the root of these films, and honestly, I don't blame anybody for not wanting to engage with them because of that. But you know what? Let's treat the source material the same way that the franchise treats The Curse of La Llorona for a second, and just talk about the films themselves. Aside from the aforementioned baggage, one of the reasons that the Conjuring franchise might get overlooked is because it doesn't neatly fit into the 3 major modes of contemporary horror that we're used to talking about. These aren't, for example, cheap studio horror films. Intentionally disposable, low-budget productions, often made by companies like Blumhouse and distributed by studios like Universal, that are designed to flood the market, opening high, and often quickly forgotten. One of the reasons that horror is so popular is because it's relatively cheap to make a horror movie, which means the potential upside is huge, and the potential loss on any individual film is minimal. The Conjuring isn't Drop, or Night Swim, or Five Nights at Freddy's. It isn't even a minor horror franchise like The Strangers, or The Purge, or The Black Phone, in which Ethan Hawke plays a child grabber who is, creatively, called the Grabber.
What do you need that grabber for, Alvin?
Grabbing.
It's a completely different beast. It also isn't a legacy horror brand, like Halloween, Texas Chainsaw, or even Scream in recent years. To be clear, the Conjuring films are undeniably nostalgic horror movies in ways that we'll discuss in a moment, but they are not nostalgic for an existing intellectual property. And finally, they also aren't, and I hate this term, elevated horror. Horror. Boy, do I hate the term elevated horror so much. I hate that it implies that older horror films weren't carefully crafted or about things. I also hate that it suggests that the films to which it's being applied aren't proper traditional horror films that are interested in things like being scary. I just hate the term so much in every possible direction. In fact, like Jack Rayner in Midsommar, I find it unbearable. Still, accepting that, there is an aesthetic in modern horror that is typically classified, and I would argue inaccurately, in that way.
What does that mean, elevated horror?
It's like scary, but with complex emotional and thematic underpinnings. It's not just some schlocky cheeseball nonsense with wall-to-wall jump scares.
That sounds kind of boring to me.
Personally, I prefer to use Charles Bramsco's descriptor, metaphor. They're kind of like pornography in that you know them when you see them. These are often more artisanal horror movies, often released by more artisanal studios like A24 or Neon. The label of elevated perhaps has more to say about how the films are marketed and discussed than it does about the films themselves. But these are the films that generate think pieces and discourse, often spiritual descendants of older horror movies like Don't Look Now or The Wicker Man. Of course, it's worth conceding that these are just general categorizations, and there are films that exist in multiple categories simultaneously. For example, there's been a recent glut of low-budget studio disposable films that have the form of metaphor. I'm thinking, for example, of The Woman in the Yard, or more recently, Him, which seems to be a horror movie premised entirely around the pun of sacrificing a goat.
I want to be the goat.
And while the film itself may not be great, let's just say game recognized game. It's also possible for the Lega sequels in long-running horror franchises to be treated like cheap and disposable fare. For example, this summer's I Know What You Did Last Summer. And while we're talking about hook-handed serial killers, Lega sequels can also go the other direction as well. Nia DaCosta's Candyman, for example, is a metaphor about the commodification of trauma as art. But broadly speaking, these are the three modes in which you can understand contemporary horror, with some overlap and some ambiguity between them. The Conjuring franchise doesn't fit neatly within any of these three buckets. It's not cheap, disposable, lowbrow fare. It's also not a historically or culturally important intellectual property. And finally, it's not whatever term you want to apply to the prestige-adjacent horror movie.
What? I had to go.
The Conjuring franchise is, for lack of a better word, aggressively middle-brow. It is pop, mainstream, blockbuster horror. Now there is, to be clear, a very obvious precedent for this. As much as the history of horror is interwoven with the history of independent cinema, the genre was central to the evolution of what we understand today to be blockbuster cinema. During the 1960s and 70s, while there was a vibrant B-movie circuit and any number of classics emerging from it, there were also a number of horrors that managed to break through into the mainstream culture. I'm thinking, for example, of Rosemary's Baby, which was the 7th highest grossing film of 1968 and was nominated for 2 Oscars, winning 1. Or The Omen, which was the 7th highest grossing movie of 1976, also nominated for 2 Oscars, and also won 1 of them. Hell, even going into the early 1980s, Steven Spielberg produced Poltergeist, which breaks the trend by being the 8th highest grossing movie of 1982, and being nominated for 3 Oscars, none of which it won. Actually, if you want to indulge me for a second and we want to roll back here, you'll notice that the reason why Poltergeist is the 8th highest grossing movie of the year is because Ungolden Pond is counted despite being released in December 1981. If we remove that from the calculation, Poltergeist becomes the 7th highest grossing movie of the year, and I think we can all forget about 666 because the real number of the beast is... You've probably already guessed, but the big one here is The Exorcist, which was the highest grossing movie of 1973, and was nominated for 10 Oscars, including Best Picture, and won 2 for Sound and Screenplay. It's hard to oversell just how big a cultural phenomenon The Exorcist was. People would queue all day for a chance to see the film, and the crowds became a media phenomenon of themselves.
We have people coming. This morning they were standing in line at 4:30 in the morning for the 10:30 show, and we've just had sellouts every day. About 2 hours before the performance even begins, we've already got enough people in line to sell out the theater. They'll stand in line in the rain, they'll stand in line under all kinds of conditions, and they all seem to just really enjoy it when they come in. We've never had anyone complain about the wait being too long for the kind of movie it was. Everyone just really felt it was great.
The Exorcist was talked about in newspapers and on television.
The manager of the National Theater in Westwood says that there indeed are at least a dozen people who faint or become ill during every showing.
Of course, it would be overshadowed later in the decade by Jaws and Star Wars, but The Exorcist belongs in the conversation as a sort of proto-blockbuster like The Godfather. These movies blended classic horror storytelling with the sensibility of contemporary mainstream cinema. They were films that could be understood in the context of the trends of the time, the work of serious-minded auteurs like William Friedkin or Richard Donner, directors who would hop onto these films from, or off these films to, smashes like The French Connection or Superman. And so these horrors can be classified in that context of new Hollywood filmmaking. The Conjuring movies clearly belong to this line of 70s and 80s horror cinema, and quite intentionally so. They differ from a lot of 2010s horror in a number of significant ways. Most obviously, while they are still cheaper than superhero films, the Conjuring movies are more expensive than many contemporary horror movies, and the production value shows on screen. They're also paced and structured differently than contemporary horror movies. James Wan shoots the first Conjuring movie very deliberately, with long takes, often in mediums and wides. There are a lot of meaningful zooms, adopting the language of 70s horrors like The Exorcist. The average shot length of The Conjuring is just under 5 seconds, not only significantly higher than contemporary horrors, but also higher than contemporary blockbusters. It is, relatively speaking, a very deliberately paced movie. This visual language has become part of the storytelling of the larger Conjuring franchise. Many of the films in the series will feature an early sequence in which a long take is used to orient the audience in the house that will serve as the primary location of the action. Form and function are intertwined.
This goes on forever.
Director James Wan wears his inspirations on his sleeve. The films are actually set in the 70s and into the 80s. There's a heavy influence of the handheld pseudo-documentary approach that director William Friedkin brought to The Exorcist from The French Connection. There are often direct lifts, for example with The Conjuring 2, drawing overtly from Poltergeist in its story of a young girl haunted by television and the seemingly deadly tree just outside the family home. These films even pay lip service to the subtext of the 70s horrors that they emulate. Critics like Stephen King have argued that haunted house stories were popular in the 70s and 80s because they externalized the trauma of America in seemingly perpetual recession. When families could no longer afford to pay their mortgages, of course the home became a haunted space. In fact, many skeptics allege, and the family's former lawyer agrees, that the Amityville haunting, one of the most famous hauntings in American history and a touchstone for the Conjuring franchise to the point that it provides the opening to the second film in the series, was fabricated by the Lutz family as a way of getting them out of debt. This subtext carries over into the film adaptation of The Haunting.
I'm gonna write you a check.
The deal was cash, cash.
As King explains in Danse Macabre, in this excerpt read by William Dufresne.
The picture's subtext is one of economic unease. In terms of the times, 18% inflation, mortgage rates out of sight, gasoline selling at a cool $1.40 a gallon. The Amityville horror, like The Exorcist, could not have come along at a more opportune moment.
Fittingly, a theme of economic insecurity permeates the early Conjuring movies.
I gotta have some routes or I'm gonna lose the insurance on the rig.
We got all the money tied up in this place and had a lot of repairs on top of that.
Saying I won't be able to pay my rent this month. No, Billy, I didn't get any bloody biscuits because we don't have any bloody money!
Sure, why not? We've got nothing keeping us here now.
Nothing but my family and all the money we don't have.
This might be an underappreciated aspect of why these movies have resonated in the way that they do. After all, the Conjuring franchise emerged in the middle of a Great Recession, while unpopular wars waged abroad, in a time of political uncertainty. It makes sense that 1970s horror would resonate with audiences in that larger context. There's also a broader point to be made about the Conjuring franchise resonating with the culture in an era of cultural retrenchment. Just as the 1970s were a backlash against the social liberalism of the 1960s, the mid to late 2010s saw a similar swing to the right in American contemporary politics. You can see these social anxieties playing out through the Conjuring franchise. Last Rites, for example, is a fascinating study of masculine insecurity, with its misfiring shotgun, its cuckolded spirits, and the insecurity of girl dads, all unfolding in the shadow of Pittsburgh's coal and steel industries. In keeping with those populist horrors like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, and The Omen, the Conjuring films are also subtly Christian, specifically Catholic. Subtly now. So subtle.
You said that God brought us together for a reason, right?
You'd barely notice.
God brought us together for a reason? This is it.
In an era where faith-based filmmaking has largely migrated to specialty studios, providing retirement opportunities for actors you forgot existed in 90s television, the Conjuring franchise is perhaps the most overtly Christian franchise in contemporary mainstream American pop culture. Also, not unrelated, there's a lot of absent dad stuff at play here.
Don't mind me asking, is your ex-husband still in the picture?
No.
Any chance of reconciliation?
He had twins with a woman from around the corner.
I'm gonna take that as a no.
So in these ways, the Conjuring franchise is decidedly old-fashioned. It's a revival of an old-fashioned mode of populist mainstream horror filmmaking, and it arguably paved the way for more recent mainstream horror blockbusters like It and perhaps even Sinners. However, there are also ways in which the franchise is decidedly modern. If films like Rosemary's Baby, The Exorcist, The Omen, and Poltergeist hybridize horror storytelling with the popular cinema of the time, the Conjuring franchise does something similar. While those earlier horrors embraced a director-driven style and a contemporary urgency, James Wan's big innovation with The Conjuring was to embrace the language of the modern franchise film and to thread it into this very traditional framework. Of course, before we continue, it's worth acknowledging that this is not especially novel of itself. The Universal monster movies had built a shared universe 70 years earlier, starting with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. During the 1940s, Universal crashed its iconic monsters into one another in movies like House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, before the franchise collapsed into self-parody with a series of Abbott and Costello vehicles. In some ways, the cinematic shared universe thrived in horror long before superheroes made the transition to celluloid. The first Conjuring movie makes a point to lean heavily on the possessed doll Annabelle. The film opens with an extended showcase for the doll. It then later draws the audience's attention to it during another exposition scene.
Say, is the Annabelle doll here?
Right this way.
This is not designed to pay off anything in the movie itself or even in a direct sequel, but to set up a spin-off that would be in theaters just 14 months later. The Warrens also keep a museum in their own house of mementos from previous cases. Typically, a movie will end with the Warrens bringing a trophy home from each case and storing it in that room. This allows the Conjuring series to build the sort of internal continuity that is typical of modern franchise fare. The first film ends with a throwaway line that is designed to tease the setup for a sequel.
There's a case in Long Island he'd like to discuss.
Really?
Promising that the Warrens are going to Amityville in much the same way that a comic book movie would throw breadcrumbs for future character development. However, Wan doesn't really lean into this modern storytelling sensibility until The Conjuring 2. Now, this is not necessarily a good film, but it is a fascinating one. It is the purest hybrid of a classic horror movie with a contemporary blockbuster sensibility. It increases the scale of the action, extending the runtime to a bladder-bursting 2 hours and a quarter, more in line with a superhero movie than a classic horror. The film introduces the demon Valak, who is capable of haunting multiple places simultaneously and would go on to be described as the greatest evil in the Conjuring universe. The film also engages in power scaling, literally stating to the audience that this next haunting is absolutely as high stakes as the last one was.
They're calling it England's Amityville. Great.
There are digitally rendered characters. It sends our 2 intrepid ghost hunters overseas, although I can't for the life of me remember where they go. I mean, that could be literally anywhere. If only there were some subtle hint. I'll never figure it out. The Conjuring 2 is the rare horror movie to feature a car chase. It also includes a computer-generated action sequence. And just as the first film had seeded Annabelle for her crossover, the sequel makes sure to include The Nun, who you can follow to her own film franchise. The Nun. If nothing else, the naming is on point.
As requested, we're here to speak with the nuns.
The franchise builds an interconnectivity that would make the MCU jealous.
Take Maurice here.
This random guy from a show reel in The Conjuring comes back as a major character in the Nun franchise.
Call me Frenchie. Everyone does.
Played by a different actor, but what you gonna do? When Annabelle comes home, you bet your ass Father Gordon does too. Hell, Annabelle even spins off national treasure Tony Amendola into The Curse of La Llorona. And don't let anybody tell you it's not the same character, because the movie stops dead for this exposition.
There was an incident with a doll.
And I know what you're thinking. Darren, that could be any killer doll.
It opened my mind to possibilities out of the ordinary.
But it does also show this flashback. This blockbuster sensibility carries over into the spin-off franchise. The Nun is a horror movie that builds to an action climax involving underwater wrestling. It's utter nonsense. While the critical response to these movies was not always great, and while the movies themselves were not always good, there's no denying that the franchise established a brand, and it built a relationship with audiences that was much more consistent and reliable than many larger and more high-profile shared universes. Certainly, the Conjuring franchise demonstrated a much more successful way of wedding classic horror tropes to blockbuster storytelling than the contemporaneous Dark universe. But you know what? I don't know if The Conjuring ever had a cast photo like this, so I guess it about evens out. For the better part of a decade, Hollywood has eagerly chased the Marvel Cinematic Universe, trying to build out shared universes of blockbuster properties. These franchises have, more often than not, completely collapsed into themselves. In that context, the relatively undersung success of the Conjuring franchise is interesting, because it suggests that the best strategy for studios hoping to copy Disney's success building the Marvel Cinematic Universe might be to branch out into different genres and other modes. Audiences clearly respond to these tropes and to this sort of interconnected world building when applied to novel genres. But it seems like one of the bigger problems that Hollywood has had in emulating the success of the MCU is down to sticking too rigidly to the formula. Maybe audiences don't need 3 or 4 different shared universes of superheroes, or blockbusters that may as well be superhero films. Viewers might be interested in shared universes built around different kinds of movies, different genres, different tones, different styles. Maybe those universes should be driven by filmmakers like James Wan, who has co-created no fewer than 3 massively successful horror franchises, and also Malignant, which deserves to be a massively successful horror franchise. The Conjuring universe is built very similarly to the Marvel Cinematic Universe in terms of how it structures its crossovers and how its movies relate to one another, but the films themselves are very different in their styles. There is something in the way that these movies combine old-fashioned formalism with the conventions of modern blockbuster storytelling to create something that clearly resonates with audiences. Maybe the lesson that Hollywood should take from this success is that it's possible to wed classic old-school filmmaking to this new approach to franchising. Maybe that's a lesson worth sharing in this or any universe. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop. Because this isn't a review show, it occurs to me that I didn't talk too much about what I think of the quality of the individual movies in the franchise. Having rewatched a bunch of them for this video, I still think the original Conjuring is very, very good. Annabelle Creation is much better than it should be. The Conjuring 2 is a really interesting genre hybrid that doesn't quite work, but is fascinating despite that. Annabelle Comes Home is actually a surprisingly good baby's first horror film, a nice on-road to the franchise for younger viewers who might be interested. The Nun movies are terrible, and the 2 most recent Conjuring sequels are not good. Also, Annabelle sucks. And The Curse of La Llorona is very bad. So we're batting somewhere in the region of 40 to 50% here. But, and I hope this came across in the video, I do think the franchise itself is absolutely fascinating. Cheers!